Welcome to another episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome, everybody, again to another episode of our show. Today, bringing another really awesome guest to the show involved in science and technology, focused on creating a better tomorrow for many people out there. Today, we have the honor of being joined on the show by Dr. Chari Cohen, who is the president of the Hepatitis B Foundation, which is a global nonprofit that's dedicated to finding a cure, as well as improving the quality of life for people affected by hepatitis B worldwide. Dr. Cohen conducts research and implements various programs focused on reducing the health disparities associated with Hep B, as well as improving health outcomes associated with the disease, as well as hepatitis D and liver cancer. Dr. Cohen, in addition to these roles, serves as co-chair of the Hep B United Coalition, co-founder and chair of the Hep B United Philadelphia, co-founder and chair of the Coalition Against Hepatitis for People of African Origin, and immediate past co-chair of Hep Free PA Coalition. She's also a member of the International Coalition to Eliminate Hepatitis B Steering Committee, HepVu Advisory Committee, which is a really interesting online platform to visualize and disseminate data about viral hepatitis across the United States, and as well as the Hep B Forum for Collaborative Research. In addition, she also serves as both a professor and adjunct faculty, professor at the Baruch S. Blumberg Institute, but also adjunct faculty for Geisinger Commonwealth School of Medicine. Did her doctorate in community health and prevention from here in Philly at Drexel University, her master's over at Temple, and a lot to get into today. Very important topic. Honored to have with us Dr. Chari Cohen. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show.
Thank you so much for having me today. There's nothing I love more than talking about how we can eliminate Hep B and liver cancer.
Absolutely. Extremely important topic. And I look into getting into all of these topics today, and extremely very timely as well. So, Chari, I'd like to start off, though, with you to talk a little bit about you and your background. You know, I love taking a sort of a trip through our guests' publication history and everything they've been involved in, and, you know, looking at your background in public health even before you started focusing on Hep B. You know, you've been involved in everything from studying herpes simplex virus to campaigns to eliminate mercury, bone marrow transplants, and leukapheresis. Take us. What got you into the Hep B space to begin with? And I know you published your PhD on high-risk populations here in the Philadelphia area and Asian Pacific Island communities. Take us sort of 2015 and what got you focused specifically on this topic, if you would.
Sure. So when I was getting my master's of public health at Temple, we needed to do a research project in order to graduate. And prior to that, I actually had been in the molecular biology world. I studied cell and molecular biology at Lafayette College. And when I graduated college, had to decide which direction to go. And my first stop was the NIH. So I did a one-year fellowship at the National Cancer Institute, worked on Ewing sarcoma, cell and molecular biology. And while I was there, you know, one of the great things about being at the NIH is the opportunity to talk to incredible scientists and to go to lunch and learns and brown bags and webinars, and the world of infectious diseases that caused cancer was open to me. And there are other viruses that cause cancer, but to me, it was a really great place to study. So when I was getting my master's in public health, I had to think about the area that I wanted to go in. And they had this big book of organizations in and around the Philadelphia region and said, you know, we can connect you with any one of these groups. And I saw the Hepatitis B Foundation. This was 1999. I saw the Hepatitis B Foundation and I looked up a little bit more about Hep B, and all of a sudden I had this incredible area to study that was where my interest lied, a virus that causes cancer. And so I wound up doing my graduate student project with the Hepatitis B Foundation. And when I graduated in May of 2001, the co-founders, we were tiny at the time, it was basically 3 or 4 people, and the co-founder said to me, why don't you stay and let's see if we can build a public health program. And that's kind of how it started. So I started officially in 2001.
Excellent. And let's lay the groundwork here, because and I don't even like I did a show on influenza the other day, and I made a point that I don't like calling it the flu. I think it waters it down too much, and with this case, I don't like calling it Hep B. I like calling it what it is. It's hepatitis B. It's an extremely nasty virus of this hepatinovirus family. Major infection of the liver damage, cirrhosis, liver cancer, and we'll be getting into the obviously sort of the anti-infective, anti-cancer dual nature of the vaccine in a little bit. Talk a little bit about the virus and talk a little about, the numbers are still quite staggering, although we don't have a tremendous amount of deaths here in the United States. We're still talking about over 1 million worldwide. And a virus that, is weird in the sense that it has this, from the genomics perspective, and we'll get there as well, circular DNA, all sorts of other interesting things in terms of its structure that make it kind of hard to drug. But again, we'll be going there in a little bit. Talk about hepatitis B in general and why, here we are in 2025, 1.1 million deaths worldwide still. Take us into that.
Sure. It amazes me that we don't talk about hepatitis B more, to be honest, considering how much illness and death it causes, both in the US and worldwide. We are actually coming up to the 60th anniversary of when the virus was discovered by Dr. Bruce Blumberg and his team in Philadelphia. And right now, there are almost 300 million people worldwide living with chronic hepatitis B infection. And up to 25% of them, 25% of 300 million people will ultimately, without access to treatment, will die of mostly liver cancer, which is why you see 1.1 million people dying every year of hepatitis B related disease. And so we have a situation where it is one of the most common chronic infections. It actually is the most common chronic infection in the world. A situation where it's the number 2 most important known human carcinogen, right after tobacco, in the number of deaths it causes. We have a disease that's completely preventable with vaccination, and it's fairly well treatable. We don't have a cure, but it is fairly well treatable in a way that we can prevent liver cancer deaths. So we have these really simple tools, and we could essentially eliminate hepatitis B to a point where almost nobody gets it and almost nobody dies from it, yet we're not. We have these great tools that we just aren't using effectively. And even in the US, I think the numbers are often surprising for people. It's estimated that up to 2.4 million people in the US are living with chronic hepatitis B infection. There are thousands of new infections every year. There are even a few mother-to-child transmission infections that happen every year. And in the last 10 years, sort of associated with the opioid epidemic, although some of the new infections we see, we're not exactly sure why, but we are actually seeing increases in acute infection across the US as well. So we don't talk about it a lot. It's not prioritized the way it needs to be, but it is a severely impactful virus.
Absolutely. And, you mentioned Dr. Bruce Blumberg, and just, disclosure here, Barry, which I'll refer to him as, was my neighbor for 14 years prior to his passing. Got to know him very well, and a lovely gentleman, very humble. And, this goes back now to research into the 1960s, which later earned him the Nobel Prize. But take us a little into the story, because here in the creation of this first dual vaccine, which is antivirus and anti-cancer in one, Barry goes on a wonderful journey to the Australian outback, Fox Chase Cancer Center, to create an amazing tool, which, has done an amazing job at preventing the disease, and ultimately not the disease progression, pathology, but obviously the liver cancer and so forth that comes from it. Talk a little bit about Barry, and a little bit of the 60s and 70s era, because that's an important piece of understanding and where we're going later in our discussion with the Institute and what you're doing.
Yep, absolutely. I can't say that I knew him as well as you did, but I had the honor and pleasure of working with Barry, with Dr. Blumberg. He was one of the co-founders. So Hepatitis B Foundation and the Blumberg Institute were co-founded by Dr. Timothy and Joan Block and another couple, Paul and Jan Whitty, in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, which is where they lived at the time. And Dr. Block is and was a virologist working in herpes simplex virus. And his wife, Joan, was diagnosed with hepatitis B, and they decided that they wanted to do something about it. And at the time, when Joan was diagnosed in the late 80s, early 90s, there was nothing for hepatitis B. There were no approved treatments. And one of the first things they did was contacted Dr. Blumberg and said, we want to help find a cure. We want to do something about this virus. And in true Barry form, he invited them to Oxford, and they went. They took their family. They went to Oxford, where he was at the time, and Tim studied the virus. And it was how really the foundation and the Blumberg Institute were started. And Dr. Blumberg worked with us until he passed away, and he came in at least once or twice a month, and we all had the pleasure of working with him. But when we talk about hepatitis B, the really nice piece for me is talking about it as a Philadelphia story. Hepatitis B is a Philadelphia story. The virus was discovered in Philadelphia. Dr. Blumberg and his team were working at Fox Chase Cancer Center. They were not looking for a virus. And Dr. Blumberg wrote a really great book about it, which you can find, about the story. So, one of his theories was that different people around the world had different genetic susceptibilities to disease. And so he went around the world collecting blood and collecting health outcomes and trying to basically see what he could find, what kind of trends they found. And one of the things they found was that people who had this certain protein in their blood also had cirrhosis. And I'm simplifying it quite a lot, but ultimately it led to the discovery of this new virus. And at the time, they knew that hepatitis was potentially infectious, but they didn't know what was causing it. And they certainly didn't know that there were different viruses, right? And so hepatitis B was actually the first viral hepatitis that was discovered. Before hepatitis C was discovered, before hepatitis A was discovered, hepatitis D, hepatitis E, et cetera. And at the time, they didn't really know what they were dealing with. And so once they realized that they had this virus that was infecting the liver and causing hepatitis, then the incredible work really began, because they were able to, first off, working with Dr. Irving Millman, who was another Philadelphia pioneer, they developed the first vaccine for this virus pretty quickly, as a matter of fact. And that turnaround was incredible. So the first vaccine was developed in Philadelphia. They also discovered the first model for studying hepatitis B, which was the woodchuck model in the Philadelphia woodchuck. So the work has really been here. And then, of course, soon after, they did a number of studies and found out working with other scientists around the world, they realized that they were dealing with a virus that caused cancer. And up until this, there was no proof and really no evidence that chronic viruses could lead to cancer. So this was groundbreaking. And it was one of the reasons, of course, that Dr. Blumberg was awarded the Nobel Prize.
Yep. And one other area I'd love to go into before we get into the research programs is that, obviously as you're saying, the vaccine has done so much in terms of preventing the disease, preventing liver cancer. We'll get into the whole issue with mother-baby transmission a little later on, and its important role there. We do have in the United States, some approved drugs for hepatitis B. Not enough, and we'll go into your programs in a little bit. Talk a little bit about what we have today. I mean, we really have two classifications. One, the interferon products, which are, in essence, immunomodulators, and then the class of the nucleoside analogs. And I sort of think of them as sort of like the first generation sort of HIV products that did, their thing quite well, but a lot came after that. Talk a little bit about what patients today have available in terms of FDA-approved therapeutics for Hep B.
Yeah, so right now, chronic hepatitis B infection has no cure. Although there are people who will recover on their own and who will spontaneously clear an acute infection. The interesting thing about the virus itself is that it's very tricky and it is good at sustaining itself. And so there's a couple of, as you mentioned, quirks with the hepatitis B virus. One is it integrates its DNA into the host genome. So you have DNA integration that happens, which makes it very hard to clear the virus 100% from a person's body. And the other thing that the virus does is that it creates these little, we call them cccDNA, covalently closed circular DNA. And there's these little pieces of DNA that also help to perpetuate the virus and perpetuate the chronicity of the virus. So for a lot of people who are acutely or newly exposed or infected with the virus, they will have an acute infection. They will recover from their acute infection, and essentially they can move on with their life. Most people never even know that they had an acute infection to hepatitis B, but the virus will actually stay in their body. And what that means is that it can be reactivated later in life were they to have some immune suppression. So for people, some people don't find out that they were ever infected with hepatitis B until one day they are diagnosed with cancer and they have to undergo chemotherapy, which suppresses their immune system. And all of a sudden they have this virus that reactivates that they never knew about, which can be pretty dangerous. Now, there are other people who will be infected with hepatitis B. They'll go through the acute phase and they will not be able to control the virus. Their immune system will not control the virus. And they develop what we call a chronic infection, meaning that those person always have some low level of replication of the virus happening in their body. And those are the folks who are at significantly higher risk for developing liver cancer, as well as transmitting the virus to others mostly through blood contact, but also through sexual contact. So if you have chronic hepatitis B infection, the key, right, until we have a cure, the key is to control viral replication. So you want to keep viral replication down, and that can prevent or control the virus in order to prevent cirrhosis and liver cancer, right? So the less viral replication you have, the better for your long-term health outcomes. And that's where both the interferons and the antivirals come into play. The interferons, which, as you know, are injection-based sort of immune modulators, they're short-term treatment. They're not meant to be taken forever. Most of the time it's, a year or so, give or take. But they have quite a lot of side effects associated with them. It's a tough therapy, and interferons are typically not the first treatment that clinicians want to give, and it's not the first treatment that patients want to take. And so really what we wind up with both in the US and worldwide is the antivirals. And these are oral pills. You can take one pill a day. Most of the time you're taking it for many years or the rest of your life once you start, but they provide long-term suppression in the same way that the antivirals, and in fact, many of the same antivirals, provide long-term suppression of HIV for those people who are infected with HIV. Really, there's two, we can call them three frontline drugs. One is tenofovir, one is low-dose tenofovir or TAF, tenofovir alafenamide, and then the other one is entecavir. So there aren't that many options for people with hepatitis B. You're really talking about kind of two drugs that are FDA approved, three if you count the two different kinds of tenofovir. And if outside of that's it. And so there are people who, even though resistance, it's hard to build up resistance. They have very low resistance profiles, which is good. But some people will develop resistance to these drugs. And the antivirals, while they do a good job at suppressing DNA, at suppressing viral replication, they're not complete suppressors. They're not the strongest viral suppressors. And so even in a person who is virally suppressed, there's still some residual liver cancer risk there. It typically, what we say is that antiviral suppression reduces long-term liver cancer risk about 60%. So good, but not great.
Right. Hence why we need the research at the Baruch S. Blumberg Institute. So, just going into, again, looking at some of the different papers that you've been involved in the last couple of years, Chari, two stood out to me here, and then this will sort of loop into a bit of the portfolio. One was this really interesting piece. This goes back to 2018 in hepatology with you and Dr. Avi Alter of hepatitis B, hepatitis C Nobel Prize fame, and a bunch of other really important people, talking about going to this theme of the covalently closed circular DNA and gene silencing and some of the really advanced, things in this paper like cDNA mutagenesis, epigenetic modifications, other interesting strategies in terms of antisense and small interfering RNA, and then a recent paper that you published just last month in Nature entitled New Potent HBV Replication Inhibitors for Management of Chronic Hep B. And these are both things that the Institute, per its sort of portfolio, is focused on. So you have an antiviral drug discovery program going on, as well as sort of a biopharmaceutical one that goes into the topics of mRNA and gene editing and all that stuff. Reintroduce the Institute to us. I know you have the location in Bucks County. I think you have a place downtown here now as well, the Cirrhosis Center. What goes on where? And if you could talk about these two baskets, because I think they sort of feedback what you were just saying. Hey, we need novel antivirals with unique mechanisms beyond the nucleoside stuff, but we also need the more comprehensive biotech, gene editing, disease elimination stuff as well. So take us down both those routes and take your time with this one. I think there's a lot to talk about.
Yeah, sure. Happy to. When Joan and Tim Block started the foundation, it was a dual mission, and we still have a dual mission. One is to find a cure or better treatments for hepatitis B, and the other is to improve the quality of life for everyone living with hepatitis B. That's a lot of work to do, and they're very, very different buckets, but they align together really nicely. And after a couple of years, it became clear that because the buckets are so different, they split into two nonprofit organizations, which is why we now have these sister organizations, the Hepatitis B Foundation and the Baruch Blumberg Institute. So the Hepatitis B Foundation, we are in charge of all of the public health research, program implementation, policy, advocacy, education, awareness, patient support. And then the Baruch Blumberg Institute, those are the wet labs. These are the scientists, and they are the folks who are working on, as you say, trying to find better treatments for better, stronger suppression, and also drug discovery, and using precision medicine and science innovation for potential cure or functional cure. So we have the honor of working together. That means that we can take what we learn from people living with hepatitis B and share it with the scientists so that they understand what community preferences are. And then we can also take the incredible discoveries happening at the Blumberg Institute and translate that so that people in the community and clinicians understand what the drug pipeline is. So the Blumberg Institute is primarily focused on, has been focused on understanding the pathobiology of the hepatitis B virus and other related disease. Also working on developing diagnostics for early detection of liver cancer, especially non-invasive diagnostics, primarily through blood and urine, and then of course, antiviral drug discovery. And so the scientists work on biotechnology, precision medicine, drug discovery and development, cancer and they even have a cancer and regenerative medicine section as well. So incredibly enough, and we don't say this enough, but many of, or I guess I should say all of the FDA approved drugs right now for hepatitis B, the Blumberg Institute scientists had something to do with. So Blumberg Institute scientists discovered the CAMs, the capsid assembly modifiers, first-in-class modulators many are in clinical trial right now. They were the first to discover the surface antigen secretion inhibitors. And so those are the kinds of incredible drug discoveries that are happening in this really incredible institute in Bucks County, PA, the last place you would ever expect this first-in-class biotechnology center to be. But they've really made significant contributions to understanding the mechanism of viral replication and the mechanism for immunological control of the virus. Right now, the scientists are working, as you say, in different buckets. And one of those buckets is drug discovery for stronger viral suppressors for hepatitis B. And that was the crux of the paper that we published last month in Nature. Really does focus on why we need stronger viral suppressions. And that doesn't mean that we don't need a cure or a functional cure for hepatitis B. And there are scientists at the Blumberg and around the world working on that as well. So I think what we wound up with was really incredible enthusiasm and optimism for finding a cure for hepatitis B after a cure was discovered for hepatitis C. And that's another Philadelphia story, right? So Dr. Michael Sophia, who discovered or developed sofosbuvir, he developed the first cure for chronic hepatitis C infection, which is incredible and has, by the way, and will continue to save millions of lives. Also a Philadelphia story. Well, after that, I think a lot of scientists working in hepatitis C then said, okay, well, now let's do this for Hep B. Let's find a cure for hepatitis B. And so we wound up with a critical mass of scientists in academia, scientists in the nonprofit world, and corporate industry scientists really working towards finding a cure for hepatitis B. And I think it quickly found out that it's not as easy. And it wasn't easy to find a cure for Hep C, but it's even trickier. This is a very tricky virus, as we've talked about, because of the DNA integration, because of the cccDNA. It's been harder to find a cure or even a functional cure for hepatitis B. And we don't know how much longer it's going to take. We think we're going to get there. And there are some promising functional cure combination therapies in clinical trial right now, but we're not sure how long it's going to take. And while we're waiting, we need better suppressors for this chronic illness, as we know, which causes liver cancer. And that's where that paper comes in. And we think that there is, we think we can do both. We're not looking for better suppressors and saying, it's going to take the place of cure research. We want both. Right. We think we need both. And we also think that scientifically we can do both.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned something else there, and I wanted just to highlight that in addition to all that work, there is this I don't know if it's a subsidiary or what it exactly constitutes, but the Pennsylvania Cancer and Regenerative Medicine Research Center, part of the institute. And again, we have to think about that. Okay, so we want to stop disease, we want to delay cancer, we want to cure people. At the same time, when you think about the liver and cirrhosis and all this damage, we want to repair, and hence the regenerative medicine theme is quite an exciting piece to that. And you talk a lot about Philadelphia stories. Fox Chase, where Barry did all this work, also was the home of the first cloning experiments back in 1952. It was the home for one of my heroes, B. Mintz, until she passed a couple of years ago, and her work in embryology, which has some interesting connections to viral suppression as well. That's a different episode, but I love the connection to regenerative medicine, because I think that's sort of there's that nice sort of developmental biology, sort of embryology, virology connection, all in one. Just say a couple words of what's going on there, because I think a lot of things that they're working on, it's not just liver regeneration. You're working on prostate cancer and other things. What's happening in that institute?
So I'm going to be honest and say I only know that institute, the work that's done there tangentially, remembering that I'm a lowly public health scientist, not a molecular biologist anymore,
no worries.
But I can tell you, so that's run by Dr. Richard Pestel, who has many, many years. I mean, he's one of the leading experts in prostate and breast cancer research. He leads, and you're right, it is not on site at the biotech center. It's still in Pennsylvania, but it's off-site, and they work primarily on prostate cancer and breast cancer. And the other thing that you picked up on is that it all kind of melds together. All the research done helps inform the other research done. So even though they're not working on necessarily liver disease or hepatitis B, it actually informs other research. And another thing that the Blumberg scientists are doing is, hepatitis B is not the only virus they work on either. So they're also working on other RNA viruses, some that cause hepatitis. One is yellow fever. So right now I'm sure you've read about, there's a robust yellow fever program at the Blumberg Institute, which actually might lead to the first FDA approved cure for yellow fever. So, but the interesting thing about that is the strategies that you use looking at other viruses can actually inform the work that you're doing in hepatitis B, and the strategies that you're learning working on regenerative medicine and precision medicine for breast cancer, prostate cancer will inform the work you do in liver cancer. And so it's this beautiful synergy, and you have multiple scientists from different divisions coming together to work with. So I can't say that I know any more than that. But if you speak to the scientists, the work they're doing fascinates me.
Yeah, and me too. And again, it was just, the thinking about the interdisciplinary aspect of this, and that, how going back, sort of think about embryology, embryos have these really interesting ways to prevent virus. They can't use interferon, so they have to do other things like viral silencing. And there's a whole, again, that's a whole other show, but I wanted to point that out because it's another really cool thing that is part of the network that you put together there. So I just think that's important, and I'm glad you can say what you said about it. That's neat. And I learned a lot about hepatitis D as well. I didn't even know that existed until I was reading about that part of the work as well. But another very interesting virus that gets linked into this pathology. Chari, moving on to so obviously a lot going on in the drug development portfolio, but you also have a lot of important public health research under your purview. I was wondering if you could take this time to talk a little bit about the mother-child transmission theme, because that's another piece of the story that we don't hear about as much as we probably should. There's a very nice piece that you put out on the website recently that goes into this, as well as other important reasons we need to remember the Hep B vaccine. Talk about this aspect of it and some of the work that you're doing in terms of mother-to-child transmission awareness.
Yeah, one of the reasons there are almost 300 million people living with hepatitis B, and one of the reasons that hepatitis B infection so severely impacts multiple generations of families is because the virus is actually transmitted from mother to child during childbirth due to blood exchange. It is not a genetic virus at all, but I will say that there's quite a lot of myths and misinformation around this kind of transmission. When you have anything that's passed down from generation to generation, over time, people theorize that it's genetic. And unfortunately, that has led to quite a lot of stigma around hepatitis B in many, many communities around the world. But because it's transmitted mother to child through childbirth, the key question becomes, how do you stop that? How do you prevent passing on hepatitis B virus infection to babies? Because what we know is that when babies are infected, when babies are exposed to the virus at birth, 90% of them will develop chronic infections. And those are the folks who will be at most risk for liver cancer later on in life. And when I say later on in life, it depends on various things, including where people live in the world, and some of that is potentially about the genotype of. So there are different genotypes of hepatitis B virus depending on where you are infected in the world. In some places, people with chronic hepatitis B, especially men with chronic hepatitis B, they're developing liver cancer in their teens and 20s and 30s, and so that is really impactful. And that's primarily in Africa. In other places of the world where chronic hepatitis B is prevalent in up to 15 or 20% of the population, people are developing liver cancer in their 50s and 60s, which again, young people. So how do you stop mother-to-child transmission? Well, luckily, we have decades of research on this, and we know that you can prevent mother-to-child transmission if you do a few things. First is using the hepatitis B vaccine, which is the simplest thing to do. We know that the birth dose of the vaccine will prevent mother-to-child transmission about 90 to 95% of the time. So essentially, when a baby is born, they're given a dose of the vaccine within 12 or 24 hours of birth. That prevents mother-to-child transmission. And actually, globally, this is in the US and outside of the US, it is recommended that every baby born in the world gets the first dose of hepatitis B vaccine within 12 or 24 hours of birth. And that's really critical because, number one, it's a very simple thing to do. The vaccine it's safe, it's effective, and it's inexpensive. And the reason we have this universal vaccine recommendation is because when you try and make risk-based recommendations, so if we were to say only babies born to moms who have hepatitis B should get vaccinated, which we used to, by the way, and there are still places in the world that do that, the outcomes are not as good. You just don't see as much coverage. You don't see as much prevention. Infections get by because some moms are not accessing perinatal care or prenatal care. So you don't know who's infected. When a mom comes to give birth in the US or outside the US, you don't always know if they have hepatitis B. Right. So it's not necessarily feasible to say we're going to stratify people by infection and non-infection. If you want to save every life, you give birth dose to every baby, regardless of the mother, whether the mother has hepatitis B or not. And so you can save most lives that way. There are some people, some pregnant people who will have higher levels of viral replication while they're pregnant, and those moms need to take antiviral treatment while they're pregnant, and that will prevent any missed, any unfortunate failures of the vaccine or any missed opportunities. So you have a situation where you can give moms antiviral treatment when they're pregnant, and that will reduce their viral load enough to make it really, really low to greatly reduce the risk of transmission. And then the baby gets the birth dose when they're born and they complete the vaccine. And by doing those two things globally, we could prevent the next generation from getting hepatitis B. We would have very, very few missed infections that way, and we really could, and that's the World Health Organization and the World Health Assembly have said that if we do what we need to do, we could eliminate hepatitis B by 2030. Now, I think we're a long way off, but it is one of the biggest challenges with the virus itself, but it's also one of our biggest opportunities. And unfortunately, right now, it's a missed opportunity because we're not implementing birth dose and we're not preventing perinatal transmission around the world the way we need to.
Okay, and another paper that just came out, this was again, this was the beginning of February, Lancet Gastroenterology and Hepatology, entitled The Urgent Need to End Hepatitis B Stigma and Discrimination. I was wondering if you could talk about that as well. I mean, when we think about sort of stigma, I think HIV, you might think mental illness and substance abuse. Talk about some of these issues as well, because again, we don't hear as much about Hep B as we should, but talk about the stigma and discrimination aspect of this disease, because again, it's as you're pointing out, hundreds of millions of people living with it. Take us down that road as well, and what you're learning.
Yeah, so we have, I know I keep saying this word, but 300 million people have chronic hepatitis B in the world, estimated, and about 2.4 million in the US. Of that, in the world, about 13% are diagnosed, and in the US, about 25% of diagnosed. So most of the people who have hepatitis B infection are not diagnosed. And of those who are diagnosed, very few are able to access care and treatment. And so in the US, about 50% of people who are diagnosed with chronic hepatitis B sustain care for their infection. Outside the US, it's less, it's maybe 20%. And so there are, of course, from a public health perspective, there are multiple reasons why people aren't getting tested and why people aren't getting access to care and treatment. One of the biggest and most overlooked issues is stigma and discrimination. And we didn't realize that hepatitis B was such a stigmatized disease until people started telling us about it. We always wondered, so I've been in this field for a long time. I worked at the Hepatitis B Foundation for 25 years. And for the first 15 of those years, we could never get anyone to come out and talk about their hepatitis B infection. 300 million people, you'd think we could get 5, right, to talk about their infection. We couldn't get anyone. And it wasn't until about 2015 when we started trying to gather more stories of people's lived experience with hepatitis B that all of a sudden people started to come out and talk. And one of the first things we learned was they were very stigmatized. People feel stigmatized with hepatitis B, and there's multiple different levels of stigma. Some of it is that the diagnosis comes along with self-stigma. So people are very, very concerned about transmitting the virus to others. And so they're worried about getting married, they're worried about having families. Adolescents are worried about sports, they're worried about, even though you can't transmit it that way, they're worried about sexual contact. And so people are internalizing stigma. And then, of course, people are treated differently. And because you have multiple generations that are impacted by hepatitis B, you have families that have completely been devastated by Hep B and liver cancer. And because of that, it's become stigmatized, where in many communities, you don't talk about the fact that you have hepatitis B because families can be considered weak or dirty, or they think that hepatitis B is punishment for bad behavior. And so there are all these cultural constructs around hepatitis B infection that further stigmatize the virus. And then, of course, in the US, we have sort of these added stigmas around foreign-born communities and limited English proficient communities, because in the US, these are communities that are disproportionately impacted by Hep B. And so you have this triple stigma on top of it. And if you cannot undo the stigma, you can't improve quality of life. But even more than that, you can't eliminate hepatitis B, because you cannot you cannot go into countries and do mass screenings and expect people to be diagnosed if they know they're going to be stigmatized. People don't want to be tested for something that's going to negatively impact their life. And it also is a challenge to get people into care. People often, they don't want to go for care because they don't want family members to know that they're on antivirals for a virus that is sexually transmitted, for example. And the other piece of this is discrimination, which really ties into the stigma, but it's a separate piece. And the discrimination piece is how people are treated differently when they have hepatitis B. And that is a major challenge for many people around the world and in the US. And so in many areas of the world, you cannot get employed. You are unemployable if you have hepatitis B. You cannot immigrate to many countries, and there's mandatory testing. And if you test positive, you can't immigrate. In many places, you can't serve in the military, including the United States. So in the US, we are lucky that because of a lot of the work we did in the mid 2000s, hepatitis B is protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act now. But we still see every year through our consult helpline, we work with people in the US, primarily healthcare providers or healthcare students, who are fired when their employers find out they have hepatitis B, or whose hospitals don't want to let them work because they have hepatitis B, or who are unable to get medical licenses or dental licenses when their state finds out they have hepatitis B. So we have schools, nursing schools, medical schools, that even though it's illegal, they try and stop students with hepatitis B from entering their programs or from working on clinicals. And so it is a hidden threat, but it is a major impact on quality of life.
Absolutely. I know it's, again, it shows sort of the interdisciplinary nature of the organization and everything you have to think about, not just in creating the novel interventions, but ultimately, as you're pointing out, the other tangible aspects of this disease. So no, it's quite impressive. I just want to ask you about one other thing, just because we've talked a lot about Philadelphia stories today. One unfortunate Philadelphia story is that, and I'm sitting like 2 miles from it, but we have one of the largest open air drug markets. I think the largest open air drug market in the United States, right here in Kensington. I know you've done some work in looking at harm reduction and ultimately identifying. There's a recent paper from November 2024 on studying the barriers to both Hep B and D screening amongst drug users in the Philadelphia area. This is in Springer harm reduction. Can you say a few words about your work here? Obviously another important piece of the prevention story. And I'd just love to, because we talked about prevention, the Narcan stuff and screening for xylazine and all that stuff as well, but on previous episodes. But can you say a few words about your work here?
Yeah, of course. And so one of the things when trying to address the opioid epidemic, of course you need to work from a harm reduction perspective, and of course you need to think about the critical acute impacts, things like overdose, right? Overdose prevention is incredibly important. And I know you've talked about that before on some of your episodes. One of the things that we didn't necessarily address universally, and we're still having trouble with, is opioid related infections. Yeah, because they may not be a person's most critical need right now if they are part of the opioid epidemic, but it's certainly going to impact their lives over time. And it's really important to be able to address opioid related infections, both to save lives and to prevent transmission. And we're talking primarily about HIV, hepatitis C, and then, of course, hepatitis B and its co-infection hepatitis D. And so around the country, many harm reduction sites and a part of the opioid epidemic response has been to test for HIV and hepatitis C and to try and prevent HIV and hepatitis C. Hepatitis B has been lost in that story to some extent. And we overall hepatitis B gets under prioritized, especially when we compare it to its other counterparts of chronic infection, Hep C and HIV. But it's a missed opportunity because if you're not thinking about hepatitis B as an opioid-related infection, then you can't address it and you can't prevent it. And we wanted to see exactly what was going on. So we worked with our incredible and longtime partners at Prevention Point, Dr. Amy Jessup, who has been working in harm reduction and working in hepatitis C, hepatitis B, and HIV for many, many years. And we said, how can we, number one, figure out what the prevalence of hepatitis B and D is among the harm reduction community, the clients who go to Prevention Point? What's the prevalence of some of these infections? And then how do we try and figure out how to prevent new infections and how to get people into care and treatment? And part of that was working within the system itself. And so it wasn't just going into the community and the clients at Prevention Point and screening people. We also wanted to figure out what was happening and talk to people. And this is where the qualitative component of public health comes in. And so we worked with the nurses, the care managers, and the clinicians at Prevention Point, and we did a qualitative assessment to find out what their biggest challenges were in addressing hepatitis B as part of their opioid response. And we also talked to clients, people who were active or recovering drug users, to find out what they knew about hepatitis B and D, where was it on their continuum of things that they were concerned about, and if we could offer them services, what would they want and what would they take us up on? And it was this incredible 6-month project where we did intensive data collection, both qualitative and quantitative. We did screening, we did vaccination, we did linkage to care, and this was all done on site at Prevention Point. And we found out and were able to document some things that we expected, which is, number one, that people who are active drug users and who are at high risk for chronic infections, they may understand their risk for HIV. They may understand their risk for Hep C. They don't understand their risk for hepatitis B, and the awareness is very, very low. And the other thing we learned was about the numerous challenges within the harm reduction setting and that the service providers have, including lack of education and training. And so while we are providing healthcare providers with pretty good education and training on how to screen for HIV, how to manage HIV, how to screen for and manage Hep C, we're not doing a great job for Hep B. And we need to do better. We need to provide more resources so that harm reduction settings can actively address hepatitis B infection. So this was the first study of its kind in the US, and we were really very grateful that we were able to get that publication out, because it can be used kind of as a model for other places. But more than that, it's documenting the challenges so that we can then go to legislators and funders and community leaders and say, hey, this is a problem. We know what we can do about it. We need some resources to get it done.
Yeah, no, I want to point that out because it's, again, speaks to the multidisciplinary aspect of what you're up to, and putting all these pieces of the puzzle together. So it's quite impressive. What else? I mean, we started talking about public health, right? We ended up with public health. We talked about vaccines and drugs and mother to baby transmission and everything else. What else is coming up that we should know about? I mean, there's a lot more. Obviously, we'll link to the website in the show notes, but other public-facing initiatives that are coming up for 2025 while we have you today, whether that's new research initiatives, conferences, talks, other things happening on the calendar. Anything else you want to talk about while we have you today, Chari? I really appreciate your time.
Of course. of course. So we have some really exciting things happening. I think one is the research that we're doing on patient engagement and treatment expansion. And so there right now with the antivirals that we have low uptake and some of it is related to low access. And so we have a situation in the US and around the world where, as you know, in order to treat for any illness, but especially chronic illnesses, there are professional medical society guidelines that state who should be treated and how they should be treated. And around the world, there are a number of professional medical societies that put out guidelines for managing chronic hepatitis B infection. Part of the problem is they all recommend different treatment for that people be treated a little bit differently. They're not necessarily even using the same nomenclature for hepatitis B. And so one of the things that is priority for us is figuring out how we expand treatment through recommending more simplified and expansive treatment guidelines so that it is easier for clinicians around the world and around the US to provide treatment and management to patients, and so that it is easier for people living with chronic hepatitis B to access and uptake hepatitis B treatment. So treatment expansion is something we are looking at very, very closely. You're going to see a paper come out in Lancet GastroHep, I'm hoping this month, that talks about the public health, clinical, and scientific rationale as to why we need to expand treatment, and calling on professional medical societies to think about what patients want and what patients need and also what clinicians want and need when they are creating their medical guidelines. So that's coming out, and we're hoping that it will make a difference from a policy perspective. We also are just kicking off our new African Capacity Building Coalition, where we are now working in 15 countries in Africa to build best practices models and to provide capacity to do things like prevent perinatal transmission and to address stigma. We've actually had some incredible wins. In fact, just a few months ago, we were able to work in one region of Nigeria, in Delta State. And they now have a policy that prevents discrimination among people with Hep B, and it also provides free screening and treatment for pregnant women and free birth dose. So we're making really good change happen. Locally here in Philadelphia, we, as you probably know, we are celebrating Dr. Blumberg's centenary. So Dr. Blumberg would be 100 years old this year. We are working with, so it's going to be the Hepatitis B Foundation, the Blumberg Institute, and the Philosophical Society. We are hosting a community forum at Ben Franklin Hall on July 29th. The invite hasn't gone out yet, but it will be a community, an event open to the community where we're going to be talking about the history and the story of Philadelphia and hepatitis B and Dr. Blumberg. And we're even going to have a scientific exhibit with some of the artifacts from Dr. Blumberg and his team. So that's going to be really cool. And then we also have our HBV international meeting, which we organize every year. That's in September. It's in Berlin. So we'll be hosting that, and we host a community forum. And one of the really cool things about that is we host an emerging scientist workshop where young people who have just entered the field of Hep B and Hep D and liver cancer, we host workshops for them to provide support and training and engagement and advice on things like finding funding and research trajectory. Do you want to go into academic research? Do you want to go into industry research, federal research? And so one of the things we're trying to do is make sure that we have a very well supported next generation of scientists. So those are just a couple of highlights. There's of course always more happening, but everyone can sign up for our newsletter or go on our website and see what we have going on.
Awesome. And yeah, I mean, we'll put the link to all of that. Is there a link yet for the Franklin Hall Centennial announcement?
No, because it's not in July, we wouldn't put out the invite this soon, but it will be coming in probably in early spring. And we're going to be blasting that out both through the Philosophical Society's links and through ours as well. So the networks, we're hoping to blast it out pretty widely locally, and that Ben Franklin Hall is an incredible place to host a Blumberg Centenary event.
No, that'll be amazing. That'll really be amazing. We'll keep we'll put notes to that as well, but we'll really be on the lookout because I was unaware that was happening, but that's great. No, really, no, it's again, it's an extremely impressive story that spans multiple decades. it's prevention, it's treatment, it's advocacy and public health. I'm very impressive what you put together there, Chari, with you and your team and all the different initiatives, and just really wishing you and everyone the best with it as you continue to move these programs forward. Again, for everybody that is going to be listening to this episode of our show across the various podcasts or watching on the YouTube channel. Again, you've been spending time with Dr. Chari Cohen, President, Hepatitis B Foundation. Chari, I want to thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to talk to us for a little while today and educate us on this amazing set of programs. Thank you for everything you do there for patients around the world. And as we like to say on our show, thanks for helping to create a better tomorrow for them via what you do. Really a great story, and I'll continue to follow this. And again, awesome program.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And every time and every way that we can showcase the needs in hepatitis B and liver cancer, it's a win for us. So thank you for prioritizing this.
Yeah, no, it was great having you. Really great discussion.